What do you think? What do you think about, let's just take the three stories as a starting point. This was the agenda of economics. It was to inquire into the causes of growth. And these are the three stories economists have told about growth, roughly speaking. Do they raise any problems for you?
I think in terms of the neoclassical view that state or public expenditure is inefficient compared to private expenditure is I disagree with that, because if you, as you said, if you look at the United States, arguably the United States military is one of the best development of technology, which is then used for the private sector. If you look at the iPhone, the GPS, the other apps on that come from the US military. And I think a lot of innovations actually come from state companies and state expenditures rather than private sector.
But is the argument that they would have come, I mean, there could be two counter-arguments. One is that they would have come anyway, it's immaterial that the investment came from one source rather than another. The second is they might not have come, but then they weren't needed really. They were artificial in a way. There would have been other developments. The investment would have gone into other areas, and maybe we wouldn't have had all these things, but we would have had other things. So in fact, some advantage, there was some opportunity cost in making those investments. I mean, that could be another argument. What we have isn't necessarily what we should have had if we'd allowed the market to.
I suppose my kind of argument is sort of along the lines of Patrick Chang, that we should look at the historical, not sort of think about these alternative histories, and that our history provides one of the best sort of point of analysis for making choice about our future, right? So if we know that this kind of partnership has worked in the past, it's a very good starting point for a policy prescription for the future. My argument is that because these things have happened in the past, and they've proven to work, we should take special attention to it, essentially.
What is it? Are you saying that we shouldn't pay attention to history, or we should?
No, I'm saying basically using.
We should.
Yeah, Patrick Chang's like you should look at history, economic history.
Yeah. Well, I agree absolutely. I mean, I start with this sort of bias in favor of history because that was my first discipline, and so I still tend to look at economic theory in historical frameworks, which means that I attach quite a lot of importance to their contingency and don't think of them as absolute truths valid at all times and all places. And I tend to look at them in the context of structures of one kind or another, which give rise to them. So in that sense, I'm very much on the side of looking at history. But nevertheless, I mean, is there something valid outside history in the free trade or in the neoclassical story or in the Adam Smith story? You see, Adam Smith, he does recognize something that is obviously important, that economic growth is promoted by trade and accumulation. Those are his 2 points. And I don't think anyone has ever disputed that ever since, given that you're committed to a growth agenda as a way of enabling mankind to escape from poverty. Those are the 2 things you need to do. Now, what people have argued about ever since is how you organize those 2 activities, whether they are best left to be generated by a market system, or to what extent they're best left to be generated by a market system, and whether they can be organized in some other way. Now, that's, I think, been the area of dispute. And I think what economists, mainstream economists, would say is that their propositions are scientific. Whereas others would say, I mean, Adam Smith starts by saying these are the two things necessary. We can't leave it to the state. It has to be done by the market. At which point someone might say, well, there's the ideology coming in. It's invading the scientific analysis of the problem. And that's where historical contingency or structural features come into the story, because Adam Smith cannot conceive of a state capable of developing the kind of trade relations and the type of accumulation necessary for economic growth.
I have a different reading of Adam Smith, actually.
Yeah.
Well, he obviously didn't approve of the state and the mercantilist state that he was observing at his time, but nevertheless he made the state's responsibility to make sure that this sort of concentration of a specific type of interest wasn't reproduced, and so the state still maintained this role in defending the market, not only in defense of outside the nation state. So the state still plays a central role, but as sort of in a neoliberal sense, as protector and creator of the market.
Yeah, well, okay, what's the role of the state in Adam Smith, and what is it the same role in neoclassical thought? I mean, there are two views of Adam Smith. One is that he's an apostle of laissez-faire, and that is sort of summed up by a quotation I gave earlier on. The other is that he actually gave the state quite substantial duties, which could be extended even. For example, he obviously made it the provider of law and order and defense and security systems. He also gave it specific tasks which would now come under the heading of public goods. And one of them was education, but the other was infrastructure. I mean, we were talking earlier about the railways, I mean, the canals in Adam Smith's day. There weren't any railways, roads and canals. So there were those duties, but he gave it, apart from those sort of bits of infrastructure, there were no other investment duties. And he also thought the state didn't need much revenue. He thought most of because the state in his day was a great stealer of remedy and of revenue, and the ruling class, which comprised the state, which was the landlord class, lived off rents, and so he attacked the mercantilist state. It was bloated. It was inefficient for that reason. It stole wealth from the merchant class and the business class who would be able to use it more productively. I think that was still the thrust of him. And you're right, he's not as laissez-faire as sometimes his followers make out to be. But by the time you get into the neoclassical system, I think the state's, now what do we think of the state's duties in neoclassical thinking?
I mean, it's generally considered to be something that should stay out of the markets, and that's about it. The markets are the most efficient determinants of utility, and utility kind of comes to the fore, like you said at the very beginning. And I think, like you also said, the divorce of well-being from economics is something that's very relevant in this question and the role of the state, because the state, in my opinion, if you can't tell from my accent, I'm American, is still very relevant, very important. And you can just take a look, for example, at the sorts of innovations, research, development, et cetera, that's been done with significant state support in the US. So like you look at NASA in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the sorts of things that they were doing and creating. I mean, we literally put people on the moon. And now, as the US research paradigm is sort of shrinking, stepping back, the government is not funding nearly at the levels that it has been, And we're getting things like Uber, and we're getting things like Airbnb. And I mean, it's essentially, you might be innovating and playing around a little bit with existing technology, but in terms of significant advances in technologies that are essential to our well-being, I mean, those really aren't happening. And I mean, you can debate me all you would like about how essential Uber may be to your well-being, but I don't think it's quite on par with, like, for example, here in England, in the UK, with the creation of the NHS and that major innovation in the post-war era.
Yeah, exactly. But you see, I think it would be wrong to say that neoclassical economics had nothing to say about state intervention outside the market. I think it in principle, it could intervene as much as it wanted outside the market. It mustn't interfere with market processes.
Then what is outside the market?
Well, for example, distribution might be through a tax system. You allow market prices to be set by in-market activities, but you might want to tax the rich. You have a progressive tax system to redistribute. That would be outside the market. You're not interfering with the determination of market rewards. I mean, that neoclassical economics did have a lot of influence on the development of the welfare state in the early 20th century. It didn't in the end, because it didn't win the argument, but there were economists arguing from a neoclassical point of view. I mean, their arguments being based on the declining marginal utility of money, that you should actually transfer money from the rich to the poor in order to increase total utility. So they were making that argument. But in the end, it didn't win. I mean, it didn't win out within the profession. You had a declining support for redistribution, which has been obviously manifested in the emasculation of welfare states in the last 30 years.
Regarding the trade theory of Adam Smith, obviously that's based on specific assumptions that Adam Smith kind of had in mind. So there's this whole kind of beaver for deer theory that I don't know how much evidence there is that actually that used to be how humans in primitive societies used to trade. So that's one assumption that he came up with, on which further assumptions were then made. And then going back to the Ricardian free trade theory as well, it is also based on specific assumptions which could have had its place at Ricardian time, but obviously things have changed since then. We have now movement of labor as well as capital and the other kind of assumptions that were based that may not be valid anymore. This is one point. And then I wanted to just go back to what we've just been talking about state, the role of state in the during neoliberalism. And I would argue that it has a huge role, and in a way the kind of extreme of neoliberalism is authoritarianism, because without state control, without state intervention, neoliberalism wouldn't be able to exist. All these policies that we currently have to be implemented by the state. They don't happen naturally. As you said, taxation, for example, or favoring business-friendly environment. They are all kind of conditions that have to be made. And even current nationalism, favoring of markets based on precarious employment, which employs mostly people who are working illegally or not, or who are vulnerable in some ways, and kind of maintaining this pool of people who are being exploited in favor of markets and the economy. So the state plays a huge role in maintaining the rules to stay like that for these people, so that to keep the market, these specific markets, in the way that benefit big countries. I mean, even here in London, London relies on foreign cleaners. If there were no foreign cleaners, London probably collapsed tomorrow. And the state dictates the rules for these cleaners that then contribute to the economy. So obviously the state plays a huge role in terms of how...
But there, can't you say that the state is simply creating the conditions for more perfect market integration. After all, if globalization is about economic integration, in other words, creating a global market, which is the ideal of a neoclassical economist or free trader, if you like. Although free traders have always, they haven't always accepted that you need a free capital movement. If you go the whole way in the neoclassical agenda, then you have all three, don't you? You have free movement of goods, you have free movement of labor, and you have free movement of capital. And that is actually what the European Union is committed to. And it is an ever more perfect market system. Now, if you have your problem that the market clearing wage as a result of free movement is considered below the standards acceptable for any particular group of people, then the argument always is that you then intervene outside the market. You don't interfere with the market clearing wage itself by, say, insisting on minimum wages, but you compensate them from outside the market. I mean, that is the classical argument, I think, which a humane neoclassical economist would support, wouldn't he? And many of the interventions of the state in favor of particular groups wouldn't be supported by, couldn't be defended much by neoclassical economics. I mean, I think neoclassical economists might be against a lot of them. They would say that a lot of actual state policy is a kind of mercantilist policy, which they would be against.
Yeah, but I think there's a difference between talking about no role of the state and obviously active role of the state in maintaining these policies. So, I mean, private companies continue to have to be bailed out by governments, and that's where the government play an active role in supporting the economy, essentially, because these companies that are too big to fail and too big to jail even.
Yeah. But of course, neoclassical economists would tend to, or the ones I've talked to often, would tend to say, well, you shouldn't bail them out. And the only reason you have to bail them out is that they were allowed to establish monopolistic positions of one kind or another by government, by legislation, supporting it or not being tough enough against it. That's why they became too big to fail, and that's why you then have to bail them out. That kind of situation represent gross imperfections and distortions in the market. And the problem with those arguments is that you always seem to feel they've got some, economists have some ideal situation always in their minds, and they regret very, very much all the imperfections that they perceive around them. They want to get rid of them somehow. And yet you also know that those imperfections are pretty integral to the way any system works, so that the utopia of mainstream economics, I mean, it is a utopia. It's never going to be realized. Therefore, you have to deal with things as they are, and therefore you have to have your models have to have some element of realism in them, which of course they don't.
I mean, that idea seems to have an inherent contradiction in it by saying that the states allowed the markets to operate as they would, and the markets produced a monopoly, and therefore the states should have been intervening actively to prevent the monopoly because the markets don't operate perfectly. And there's no real addressing of the underlying, well, what were the market conditions that allowed this monopoly to arise? If the markets were operating without proper state intervention, are you saying that states need to intervene to keep markets going properly? And I just can't quite square with, I feel like the neoliberal positions on market intervention can be very inconsistent.
I agree with that. On the one hand, you have the proposition, if markets were perfectly competitive, such and such and such would be the case. Then you say, but without interference, they would be perfectly competitive. That is the the prescriptive element, they could be made perfectly competitive, and then their benefits would be realized. But of course, they can't be made perfectly competitive. The competitive market is a purely ideal structure. It's a mental construct by economists. There never were such things, and there never could be such things. It's something I'm going to talk about a bit in my next lecture, which is what do economists mean by equilibrium? I mean, there's always this idea that there's some optimality there, which if you could only remove these interferences, would result and would carry human kind more rapidly to the point of bliss. So I think the confusion between description, explanation, and prescription runs all the way through these mental constructs that economists use. And it's very, very hard to avoid, it's very, very hard to sort it out when you're thinking about it, because people very easily slide from one to the other. What do you think would be the case? What do you think would happen? And maybe history can give us some inclination of some insight into this. What do you think would happen if there wasn't a state? Would markets develop and be efficient? And
well, I would say that markets weren't existing anymore, because the state, if we read also the pages written by Carpolani, actually has a very active role in shaping and creating markets. So not only setting the rules, but also giving a direction to economic growth, and also not only economic growth but development, because also there should be, in my opinion, a distinction to be made between these two concepts, growth and development.
good.
And
what distinction? What is the distinction you would make?
Well, probably I would look at the not only the quantitative aspects of growth, but only on qualitative sides. If we think about, you previously asked the questions, was globalization or either free trade, did it help to raising living standards? Something that is not figuring into economic discussions about growth is precisely living standards. And I think mostly because they're actually difficult to measure, where there were some tentatives like the Human Development Index developed by the United Nations, but it's not really widely adopted, and we still have to struggle with the concept of GDP that anyway is evolving, and in a way that it's accounting for different stuff, but still the economy is growing even faster than the accounting rules are evolving. So we're still struck as economists, we're still discussing and debating about quantitative concepts, leaving aside the qualitative ones. And perhaps this is also because political economy became just economics, that is to say, ruling out political arguments, but also ruling out the interdisciplinary nature, if we want to say, or characteristic of studying the economy. That is to say, being also aware that there are such disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, history, and even philosophy that should probably be part of the economist's, let's say, education.
Yeah, I agree with that, but still, don't you think that it is valuable to just keep in mind the definition of Marshall, that economics is concerned with the material prerequisites of well-being? That means there are other prerequisites of well-being that are not material, but economics is concerned with the measurable bits, and not with anything else. And isn't one of the problems with human well-being indexes that they mix up measurable and unmeasurable things, and then have to weight them in a quite arbitrary way? I'm quite in favor of restricting our inquiry, the inquiry of economics, to material things, because I think beyond that they're not competent to say anything, actually, as economists, really. But I'm not sure I agree with what I've just said, actually. I mean, they should be competent to say something, because because they have to answer the question, why should you be interested in alleviating poverty? I mean, if you can't give an answer except to say, well, it's better that people should have more things to eat than less, why? I mean, beyond starvation, that is. Why should it be better? Provided people have enough material requisites, you'll sort of come to the end of your inquiry, and yet you feel you should be going on to consider how these material prerequisites relate to other bits of life, other bits of welfare. And that's where I find there's a gap. And the only way most people can bridge it in their own minds is just to keep on a certain track in which you go on increasing the material prerequisites without actually asking what they're for any longer. And I think that's the treadmill we're on, all of us.
I would agree with that, and I think that the problem of economics just focusing on GDP is that without being sure about its underlying aims for promoting GDP, such as making people happier and enabling them to devote their life to what they consider most important and live a fulfilled life, then you can become very narrow-minded and say, look, we're just interested in high GDP, but you could have a society where their GDP is extremely high and they're all very miserable, working very hard and very competitive and jealous. And you could have another society where people are very happy, but their GDP is quite low. And without going a bit deeper in terms of your study of what you're actually aiming for in economics and what the principles are underlying the study, then it's not possible to evaluate those two societies. You're just looking at GDP. So I think that is really important. And I also wanted to say, with respect to the earlier question about how markets would manage without the state, I think that neoclassical economics assumes that state intervention in markets is something that's rarely required. Occasionally it's needed, but generally markets would be fine by themselves. But actually, I think the way things tend to work in markets is that and this is a point made by Karl Marx, that one firm tends to get bigger than the others, or a few firms tend to get bigger, and then they either join forces or the smaller one dissolves because it can't compete with the bigger firm. And so actually, the way the markets naturally tend to move is towards a monopoly situation. And you see that a lot today. There's loads of companies which, if you investigate a bit more carefully, they pretend to be different companies, but actually there's just one or two or three companies producing the goods. For example, Innocent Smoothies is owned by Coca-Cola, and I don't know what other companies Coca-Cola owns, but you think there's different companies competing in a market-based way, but actually there's some kind of monopoly that's hidden there. So I think that actually the state is required to maintain a healthy market, because without it, the movement of competitive markets tends to go towards monopoly.
Yeah, well, it's all that all seems to be very true. But of course, then you have the question of the conditions under which efficient markets can occur, and there the state obviously does play a huge role. And my feeling is that if you didn't have states, you'd just have criminality, and of course you have a lot of criminality even with states, because some states are simply criminal organizations themselves. We can all think of them. But without states, you would just have criminal activities. And eventually, you see, I think the argument might be that eventually you do get order coming out of criminality, because criminality is intolerable as a condition of life for people, and they will then take some steps to limit it. And I think that's the basis of all social contract theory, really, isn't it? That at some point people decided that life without a state was too nasty, brutal, and brutish and short, and set up a state to protect them, which is a fiction. But it's a fiction that is related to how people thought of the market system developing as well. People often thought that the self-regulating aspects of the market developed fairly spontaneously out of the problems created by unregulated markets. In other words, the markets developed their own systems of regulation. I think that is one of the main contentions of people who've studied the development of markets out of the great fairs of medieval Europe. Or of the great fairs of the ancient world. They had their own policing systems. They had, yes, all those sort of, and what?
The guilds.
The guilds. So there were always these sort of elements of order within the markets. And I think neoclassical economists have tended to build on that and say, look, we have here a self-regulating system that if it's not interfered with too much, maybe, of course, kept honest by outside interferences to some extent, it will deliver the goods we want, which is to rescue humanity from poverty and produce the material prerequisites of well-being. And so that's where we're stuck, I think, in our thought. The state is both a plus and a minus. Some people emphasize the minus aspects, and I think that's true of most neoclassical economists. They're heir to the tradition of the state being wasteful, corrupt, predatory. And then there are others who emphasize the plus, the advantage, the importance of the state in making a market system possible.
I was wondering about that because you mentioned that the mainstream story is the story of free trade, of comparative advantage. But if we look at Japan or other Asian tigers, if they would have stuck with their comparative advantage, they would have still produced agricultural goods. And so the story of the structuralist view of moving up the ladder, this developmental state, and moving beyond agricultural sector to the manufacturing sector and then to other sectors, I was wondering, how do free trade or neoliberal economists look at that? How do they explain the growth of Japan and other Asian countries, because they did not stuck to their original comparative advantage but moved along?
Well, there was a big debate about this, and I don't know where it's got to, because I sort of read a lot about it 15 or 20 years ago. There is an argument that they should have stuck to their comparative advantages, and that the idea that you put lots of resources into developing a product that will only actually help you in 15 or 20 years, there's a huge opportunity cost there. You could actually be putting those resources into things that, say, where your comparative advantage lies, which produces more accumulation for you over that than investing in things which only give you your advantage along, some way along the road. And there is that argument. You are obviously, in investing in the long term, you are actually sacrificing something that you could be making in the short term.
Mm-hmm. But then I think the argument is that if you only stick with your original comparative advantage, you're stuck with that product or that sector and can't move beyond that.
Why?
Because you will keep focusing on the short term, on your revenues that you currently have, and you won't invest in things that you will only benefit from 15 or 20 years later.
Well, yeah, is that right? I mean, if
I certainly think so. I think that brings up a good point about path dependency. If Japan, has moved all their resources over to something other than they in fact did, then as those other sectors would decline and contract, it's sort of pretty much impossible for them suddenly to transfer all those resources and capital back to those other sectors. And so that's, again, within the sort of historical perspective, I think that's important to consider.
But I mean, if you concentrate on your existing advantages, that is the source of maximizing your profits, and those profits will enable you to they will raise your income and raise the rate of accumulation,
I think that's again another distributional issue of where those profits are actually going to.
Yeah. If you're able to actually effectively marshal them into the process of learning. And I mean, this is the Heckscher-Olin model, and essentially, like, you have to be able to learn. And to bring a little bit of the political element back in the current international system, we've got patents on everything. Intellectual property law is growing stricter and stricter by the day, and it's becoming more and more difficult. I mean, for example, what China's done over the past 20 years, yes, they've been manufacturing everything, but they've also been learning how it's designed and created in the first place. And so now they're able to natively design and create and develop their own products that are just as technologically advanced as those that are designed in Silicon Valley by Apple or by Google.
Yeah.
And that's becoming less of a possibility. And so, even if you have a sudden accumulation of wealth and resources, I mean, if you can't really marshal it to improve your technological capabilities, I mean, you're going to wind up essentially squandering it, because eventually, after a while, everyone succumbs to temptation. If you're sitting on, suddenly a windfall of $10 million and you try to figure out what to do with it, and finally, you just realize you can't do anything with it, well, you might as well just waste it on, buying sports cars or giving really elevated or inflated salaries to your closest friends, so on and so forth. I mean, that's not to say that, these are necessarily all perfectly virtuous countries to begin with, but it's definitely an issue. And there's definitely an element of trying to keep sort of the periphery, developing countries out of the game and prevent this access. And that's an additional thing to overcome. And so I think that really reinforces these elements of path dependency.
I agree, and I think where you have a competition with equal technology but unequal labor, then there's a good argument for protection, because I think obviously if technology is widely diffused but labor costs are unequal among the competitors, then the cheap labor locations will swamp the more expensive ones, because you have equal technology. I mean, I think the assumption behind some of these earlier theories, because capital was supposed to be immobile, technology was not transferred readily from between the competitors, and now that it is, then maybe some. I think it's very interesting, actually, that Ricardo himself hoped that capital would remain immobile. I mean, he didn't just think of it as a fact of his time, but he said, I hope owners of capital in England will be patriotic enough to be content with a more modest profit at home than seeking maximum profit abroad. He actually said that, and you don't expect that from someone like Ricardo, but that thought has long since vanished from economics. where you try to maximize your profits wherever you can.
And I think that introduces another area where the state and what its role should be is important. It's a question that needs to be decided, because when you have these capital flows, if the capital flows turn exploitative, what redress do these states have to try and gain damages? For example, even if they can, essentially you've got, like, for example, with specifically financial capital flows and the ways that they can slip into a country, heat up a market, get immediate returns, and then slip right back out and cause collapses. How do you regulate that? How do you deal with that? How do you prepare for that? As a market, as a state, as an economy overall?
Yeah, well, look, I think we've covered this ground quite well. But just to sum up, what do you think we've got two definitions of the economics problem. One, which some of you were here yesterday, where you simply think of it as an allocation problem and work out the most efficient system of allocation of a given set of resources at any one time. And the second is you are interested in trying to secure the growth of those resources, which doesn't mean that you give up the efficiency, but that it moves, the economy moves over time and develops, with the right organization, develops more resources to satisfy human wants. Now, those are the two functions of economics as suggested by economists themselves. This is what economics is for. How far should the increase of resources be carried? How far should economists think of themselves as being responsible for things like improving the wealth, increasing the wealth of their societies? Or does their responsibility stop at a point when people have sufficient of the material prerequisites for well-being, at which point economists say, okay, well, look, it's up to others to talk about the purposes of life, the end, what the human drama is all about, and we can retire having done our job. Is there anything permanent or immortal about economics in relation to the human condition? Is it always needed? Or is it just there for a particular purpose, to get capital accumulation going and sufficiently wide markets to enable growth to take place? And once it's done that, do we need economics any longer as a discipline? Which doesn't mean that economic reasoning won't be relevant in all kinds of practical problems. Thinking like an economist for many purposes is very important. But do we need economics, the grand theories, the great textbooks, or do we need some sort of engineering manuals to sort of to solve identifiable problems of costs and benefits in ordinary everyday things we might want to do? That's a question I leave you with. I don't really know the answer. I tend to have a limited view of the matter rather than a sort of grandiloquent view of economic theory. I think it has its purposes, but it is something that I think we need to reflect about as we decide that we want to be economists. What are we doing? The old argument, there was an old thing, old kind of joke really, that you measure how good an economist is by the size of his portfolio, and A lot of people still believe that, by the way. Economists who can make money are worth listening to, and economists who can't are clearly talking hot air. So the idea that economics is about money and riches and increasing it, and it tells you how to do it, is quite deeply ingrained. But you then are always left, you're driven back to the question of how much. How much is enough?